G'day guys and welcome back to the Sera Kart Class Podcast. Today we're going to be looking at why does my kart not release out of corners? So we get this topic a lot when it comes to parents who are struggling with their kids and relates to the kids. They're saying the engine won't go. They're saying that, they're losing speed and they're losing kart lengths to the drivers around them out of the corners. So we want to try and dive into a couple of scenarios that it could be either the driver, the gear ratio, so the engine department, or it could be the setup. And if you're just trying to hone in on which one it may be, at least then when you're at the track, you can hone in on the driver saying it's your responsibility to do this, or it's the engine, we're going to try and change the gear ratio, or ultimately it's the kart setup that's actually holding us back. So if we're looking from a driver's perspective on why we might be losing speed coming out of corners, there's two factors that it may be. It may be that it's the racing line. So we tend to see if drivers are turning to the corners too early, then they're going to lose speed coming out of the corners. They're making it a narrower entry, and by doing that, they tend to get on the accelerator a little bit too late. So if you're on the accelerator 1 second later than the guys around you, the drivers around you, then you're going to lose that momentum initially. Now, this is also going to be way more dependent for our low performance classes, cadets, 4-stroke classes. Really key is to get on the gas nice and early where possible. And obviously we don't have too much oversteering with that. But if we can be on the accelerator at least the same, if not a touch before, then we should be able to keep up if everything else is correct. Now, the other thing from a driving point of view is, like I mentioned there about the oversteer, is we want to make sure that from the middle of the corner to the exit, the steering wheel is as straight as possible. If we're seeing multiple corrections from our driver's point of view, then that's just binding up the kart. So all these little corrections are just taking out a couple hundred RPM, and obviously that's going to decrease the acceleration out of the corners. And so with that, there's nothing to do with the setup, there's nothing to do with the gear ratio, it's literally just the driver just calming their hands down. Now, if you can push your hands more into the steering wheel and push yourself back into the seat, if you can drive with straighter arms rather than a big bend in your arms, you will be able to control the steering wheel a lot better. If it's a little bit hard to explain over audio, but if you've got more of a V in your arm when you're driving, then you can't really brace yourself as much. So any bump in the curb, any bump in the track, then your hands start to move around a little bit. If you've got them a lot straighter, then you can brace for those bumps. So you will feel a little bit of a tap when you hit the curb, but your hands will just start to slow down a lot and actually absorb those bumps a lot nicer. Hopefully with a bit more correction, with a bit less correction in our steering wheel, we're going to have more exit speed. So driving point of view is if you're turning in too early, you're typically on the gas too late. And when you're on the gas later, less acceleration of the turns. And the second one is if we're not being smooth with our hands from the middle to the exit, then those little corrections will take you out 200 RPM per correction, and that's going to limit your speed upon exiting. If we're looking from a gear ratio point of view, the easiest way to gain speed out of the corners is by simply adding a sprocket. Now you can add 1 or 2 sprockets, but that's increasing the size. So if you're normally using a 75, you want to go to a 76, that's going to increase the initial acceleration. You will lose some mid-range and some top-end speed as well, so take that into account. For classes that dependent on their minimum RPM. So again, our low performance classes need that higher RPM when we're going around corners because they have less acceleration as it is. If you know what number you need to hit as a low point, so for a mini rock, so a vortex, we like to see the RPM around that 7,500 as a low point, and 8,000 is normally the sweet spot. If you're driving and your driver's doing it like 7,000 RPM, for example, you could probably put 2 sprockets on. And that normally increases between 250 to 300 RPM per sprocket that you go up. So it does depend on how your driver's driving, but let's work off a sprocket being about 250 RPM increase, and that will give you a little bit more acceleration for at least the first, few kart lengths out of a corner to see whether you can improve that exit speed. From a setup point of view, if we're seeing that karts are driving away from us, I would tend to ask the driver for their feedback first. Now, this just gives me a bit of a direction on how the kart feels and what is typically happening. So if I was to ask a driver and they're going to say, the kart feels good to drive, in my head, good means that the kart's gripping And if it feels easy to drive, it's actually probably going to be a little bit on the over grip side of things. And so again, if we've got too much grip, that's going to take away some of that acceleration out of the corners. So it's more just to get a bit of a sense on what the driver's feeling without them knowing that it has too much grip or them actually trying to explain to me that it has potentially too much grip. I'm taking that if the kart's easy to drive and it's not moving around, so it's not sliding around the corners, that it's very easy, it's too much grip, and that's what's binding it up, and that's why it's losing acceleration to other drivers. So I would tend to look to loosen up the rear end of the kart a little bit. Now that could be, simply just widening the rear track width. It might mean that you go to a stiffer axle. It might mean that if you've got lead ballast on the back of the seat, you just move it towards the front of the kart. Just shifting some weight or, creating some more instability in the rear of the kart should help that acceleration out of the turns. So they're sort of they're the tips that I'm trying to recommend if your kart isn't fast at the corners. It could be the driver. If their line's looking pretty good and you can hear them on the throttle around the same spot as the other drivers that they're lacking against, then just tick that off. It's not the driver. Then if they're driving well, and again, they're simply losing acceleration, but your RPM is down, then let's look to increase the sprocket size by 1 to 2, depending on how much your low RPM is off the marks. And lastly, if your kart is, in commas, easy to drive, then look to release the rear of the kart by shifting your lead ballast. If you don't have any of that, widen the rear track. If you're already on the max rear track width, then look to go to a stiffer axle. One of those three things should simply improve your exit speed for a race day. Hope you've enjoyed this episode in our Kart Class podcast. If you're stuck with your kart racing needs, then we have a kart setup program dedicated to pointing you in the right direction. It doesn't say at this track, for this chassis, for this time of day, do this. It gives you a bit of direction on what you should be looking to adjust as a race weekend progresses or it gets worse with wet conditions. So until next time, guys, I appreciate you tuning in and we'll speak to you guys soon.